Greetings viewers, in today's video we're going to discuss the concept of using a power racket versus a control racket. Which is better for your game today? Which is better for your game long term? How should you choose? What are the basically all the factors that I look at when I'm recommending whether to lean more towards a control or more towards a power racket, depending on what kind of player you are. Like, we all know that pros have been moving to more power. They need more power to hit through these soft, slow balls. They need more power to hit through these grittier, slower courts. But what does that really mean for us recreational players? Like, I don't think it takes a genius to realize that professional tennis and recreational tennis are essentially two completely different sports. So the traditional advice is basically the worse player you are, the more powerful racket you should use. If you look at like the so-called game improvement rackets, which are designed for, like, I call them grandma rackets. Some people find that a derogatory term, but they're the most powerful frames. Massively oversized heads, super thick wide body beams. Oftentimes they're elongated and stretched out as well, so you get even more leverage. They're more head heavy for more power, but they're still light, so you can accelerate them. Those kinds of power rackets are not really the rackets that we're talking about. We're talking more about your like power oriented 100. So 300 gram, 16 by 19, 100 square inch frames, generally with thicker variable beams. So someplace in the cross section will be like 23 millimeters, but it might swell up to like 26 millimeters at the 3 and 9 o'clock location. Something like the E-Zone 100, the Babolat Pure Drive, the Pure Aero. Maybe you're looking at the Wilson Ultra 100. Rackets in that kind of realm, those are typically recommended more towards intermediate players. And lately, since pros are leaning more towards these types of rackets as well, we're kind of wondering, should even the more advanced kinds of players be using these power rackets too? And then the counterpoint to this, one that I've been seeing a lot more on Reddit recently, is that power rackets are kind of good for beginners, and they might also be good for very advanced players who already have fully developed swing speeds. But for the kind of 3.5, 4.0 player who's looking at taking their game up a notch, improving their game, going to a control racket might actually be the better solution, because that racket is going to force you to access higher racket head speeds through your swing speed. Get your weight moving through the ball with your footwork, getting that weight shift into the court better, because you have to do that with a more control-oriented racket, something like this Gravity Pro, if you want to stay in the rally against harder hitters, basically. So we've got two philosophies here. You should go with the most power possible, because pros need more power. So if pros, the hardest hitters in the world, need more power, why doesn't everybody else? And number two is, well, amateurs are not winning points by overpowering and dominating their opponent. They're winning more points by staying in the rally longer and being the last one to miss. And so the kind of thought is, well, if you've got a power racket, you might overhit a little bit, which would mentally cause you to kind of suck back into your shell and start babying the shot. And it just is like you're stuck between overhitting if you take a full swing, or not hitting it even over the net because you're scared of overhitting. And the idea is that's where a control racket might help you find that happy medium, keeping your ball in the court while encouraging you to really swing out. So between these two methodologies, which should you go for? Well, I think it really depends what you're looking for in a racket. Obviously, one way that you can kind of identify what you need in your game is by asking yourself, well, how am I losing matches? A very common way that a lot of recreational players lose matches is they're just going for too much. They see the line on their approach shot, they try to nail the ball as hard as they can right on like a dime in the corner of the line, at the back corner of the line of the baseline and the sideline where they intersect, like this perfect shot that's going to be a screaming winner. That is obviously not going to be fixed by going to a more control-oriented racket, but I often worry that people feel that going to a control-oriented racket is going to stop them from missing, when in fact the issue that a lot of people have is they just don't pick their targets correctly. And that's not always your fault. Like, you've got a ball to hit, you're looking into the court, where do you aim the ball? You've got these big, bright white lines that show exactly where the best place to hit the ball is on the target. It makes sense that we aim for the lines because they visually stand out on the court the most. But I would say, even at the professional level, it's probably not best to aim for the lines and try to hit winners. You should try to move your opponent around on the court, but trying to purely hit a winner is not a very high percentage formula when it comes to winning more points in your matches. And that is why I've been leaning more towards the idea of going for a more powerful racket. In fact, going for the most powerful racket you can control, based on the assumption that you're able to look past these big, bright white lines on the court and pick targets that are quite safe, like a meter from each line. Because I think if you can hit a harder, heavier ball into a safer location, you're probably going to win more points. But that doesn't necessarily fix this whole idea, because you might be able to aim for that safe space and still really not feel that confident with a full power racket like this E-Zone 100. This E-Zone 100 is a racket that I don't necessarily feel fully confident swinging out on every single shot either, because it can be a little bit disconnected. I don't feel like I know exactly how this racket is going to respond on every shot. And while this is an example of a high power racket that is less connected, so I don't feel as precise, it doesn't mean that all power rackets are inherently less connected. Another way that you can decide between a more powerful or a more control-oriented racket is by asking yourself, what part of tennis do you truly enjoy? If you're a match day player, you're going out and you're playing a lot of sets, you're playing leagues, you're playing tournaments, that is a whole different type of enjoyment of tennis compared to someone who just wants to rally, find that groove, go after that one perfect shot per session. I personally have enjoyed both of these parts of tennis separately. When I was a junior, I liked playing sets. I liked being a little bit more competitive. Recently, I've been really enjoying playing sets, working on all aspects of my game, including the serve, the return, rallying, the strategy that you might take in a set depending on your different types of players. But for a long time, I really just liked to rally. This was especially true when I didn't get to play as much tennis because I had to work more or be a student and study more. I wasn't always able to find the time I needed to dial in my game, so all I looked forward to were the 1 or 2 hours a week that I could find to hit, and I just wanted to groove my strokes because it's pretty hard to groove your strokes. Tennis is not an easy game. And I don't think there's much of a sweeter feeling than really perfectly finding the sweet spot on your racket after a fully swung out shot. And that is where a more control-oriented racket can be a lot more rewarding, because it just communicates that purity of shot a little bit more carefully compared to a pure power racket where a lot of balls are just going to kind of feel the same. So hopefully that kind of gave you at least a starting point on where to look within your own self on what kind of racket would be best solution for your game moving forward. If you're looking for some recommendations, I'm going to break some down into, I think, what can be very strong trade-offs between power and control, because I don't think power exists in isolation of control. I think you can generally have both of them together, especially with modern rackets. I think generally they're doing a lot better job of that, whereas 10, 15 years ago, it felt like power and control were opposites. So the two power rackets that I think are great in terms of high power, but also have a very consistent string bed, and that string bed consistency comes from a relatively firm layup of graphite, so you don't get a lot of twisting in the hand on contact, and then a very predictable string bed. So in this case, because the racket is very stable through contact, the string bed is quite consistently responsive throughout. So you're going to get a very similar response on central contact compared to off-center contact. Those would be the Babolat Pure Drive if you like a slightly higher launch angle, and the Dunlop FX500 if you want a slightly lower launch angle. I found both of these rackets to be tremendously predictable despite being also very powerful. Now, if you're looking for a power racket that offers a swing feel that is more conducive to like a classic control racket, often these are associated with more headlight balances. They help you get out in front contact, especially on lower balls, a little bit more easily. They work better with more traditional grips like semi-western at the most, and can be, I think, not the best option for more Western extreme grips, which you might just want like a pure power racket for. Those would be the Slinko Blackout V2, so that comes with a lower balance point, something that you'll find in like pro staffs. The Boom MP also comes with a lower balance point, and you really have to find the center of the string bed on that frame to get control out of it. So in that way, it also behaves a lot like a control racket, but sort of in reverse, whereas when you're looking at a control racket, you've got to hit in the middle to get power. Both the Boom MP, because the string bed is kind of variable, you have to hit it in the middle to get control. And then the last would be the Nova 100, and that one offers the traditional balance point, but if you throw a leather grip on there, it's got a slightly thinner beam compared to most power rackets, so it does feel quite whippy. I really like it on flatter shots. The launch angle is kind of high, so you might want to go with a more control-oriented string, but I think once you get used to that higher launch angle, you can kind of compensate, aim a little bit lower, and really find your groove that way. Now, when it comes to forgiving rackets with really control-oriented string beds, so these ones are going to have lower launch angles, not be super powerful necessarily, but off-center balls aren't going to completely die on you like they might with a traditional control racket like a Blade 98, for example. These would be the Yonex Percept 100, so big 100 square inch head, slightly thicker / medium thick 23mm flat beam, and then of course it's got that 18x19 string pattern that gives you tremendous directional control. A stiffer, crisper, more modern option would be the T-Fight 305S. I think the 95D feels and plays a lot more like a traditional control racket, whereas the T-Fight 305S is like this modern control racket that really rewards big, fast, modern, high top spin swings. And then the last would be even like the Ultra 100 if you want your like classic, thick, powerful beamed frame. The Ultra 100 actually has a really, really tight 16x19 string pattern, similar in a lot of ways to like the EZO 98. I think that pattern is tighter than like the tight pattern on the Arrows, for example. Now, when it comes to pure power rackets that also feel quite connected to the ball, because that's another way that I think we can find control as players, is through responsiveness of the racket, how pure your connection to the ball is, and that I think adds a lot to how rewarding a racket is to use. And that would be the Dunlop FX500, which is a very pure but firmer feeling frame, and then the Pure Aero Rafa, which is basically an Aero but completely undampened, so it's just that pure graphite feel. The FX is a little more solid feeling than the Rafa, but the Rafa I think you're going to get a lot more spin with. It's not necessarily a power frame, it is a spin frame, but I think, you know, on paper it's got all the specs to work for this. Now, when it comes to like control-oriented rackets that are going to give you that predictable string bed, that thinner beam for higher racket head speeds, but they're not going to get completely bullied around by the modern game by bigger hitters like softer Prestiges might, for example, I'd be looking at the Slinko Whiteout, very stable frame, a little bit more muted in the V2, a little bit less powerful, but also crisper, more connected. If you go for the V1, there's a T-Fight 305S, which is very similar to the Whiteout, but I think a little bit better for the modern game, a little bit more powerful, but not quite as dense feeling. There's the RF01 Pro, which I do think is a phenomenal control racket. You do have to find the middle of the string bed because you do have a pretty variable string pattern. It is also a firmer racket, and that firmness, that stiffness is what gives you the power. And last up would be something like the E-Zone 98, which I haven't always loved in the past, but if you need something quite forgiving and a little bit more comfortable, you can get pretty solid control out of that frame without losing much power, because the beam does get quite thick towards the tip of the frame. Now, for my personal recommendations on like what you should do is go for the most powerful racket that you feel like you can fully swing out. I think that's very good. I think it's also fine to just like accept that your preferences might change over time. A racket that worked for you last week might not necessarily be the one that works for you 6 months from now. Go with what excites you today. If a control racket is the thing that makes you want to go out there, that's what you should go for. Don't listen to me, who uses a pretty powerful racket, just because it's me. Like, that would be dumb. You should listen to me, especially when I tell you to use my affiliate links. And then there's also other ways that you can get more power or more control out of the existing racket you have. You can use strings to dial things in, go for a thinner gauge if you want to open things up, go for a thicker gauge if you want to get a little more control, go for a round string for more control, use natural gut or multi-filaments to open up a little bit more power. Don't be afraid of dropping your tension well into the 40s to give yourself more ball pocketing and easier depth out of a control racket.